Hey y'all, Leela with Miss Kiss Creations, and welcome back to my channel. Today's video, I want to compare CrystaLac and epoxy. If you don't know, I stopped using epoxy about 3 months ago, and I've officially switched to a non-toxic epoxy-free epoxy. When I announced that I was switching to CrystaLac, a lot of people wanted me to do a comparison video, and now that I've used CrystaLac and I've used epoxy for about 8 years in the past, it's time for me to do a comparison video from my perspective. Before I begin my full comparison, I want to be clear that I am not bashing any epoxy brand and I am not bashing CrystaLac. In my personal opinion, I believe that there are pros and cons to each product, and depending on what you are trying to do and your workspace and your personal preference, this is just my personal experience with what I've seen and what I've done with both products. The two epoxy brands that I've personally used the most are Flint Sister Supply Shop and Alumilite. I started using Alumilite in the very beginning whenever epoxy wasn't so commonly used for tumblers, and then I slowly switched to other brands. I tried a lot of brands over the years, and the last brand that I truly loved and stuck with was Flint Sister Supply Shop Epoxy. And if you do click the video that's linked in my right hand corner, it has all the explanation on why I had to switch from epoxy and why I am now using the non-toxic epoxy-free epoxy. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started with this video. Let's first start out with comparing the products' labels and their instructions. So I am going to compare the Grand Finale by CrystaLac. This is a fast dry tumbler coat. It is water-based and epoxy-free and is a gloss finish. Just like with epoxy, you have to prep your tumbler before applying your coats of CrystaLac to the tumbler. So this is a 1-part top coat. Unlike epoxies are typically 2 parts, part A and part B. This is 1 coat in a bottle. You mix well, but do not overshake, and you can apply this at room temperature between 68 to 75 degrees. That's a little cooler than epoxy. Epoxy can be up to 85 degrees. And the recoat time is about 2 hours. So after you apply your coat, you let that dry or cure on the tumbler for approximately 2 hours, and then you can apply your second coat. One important thing I want to point out with this instruction label is that you do not need to use heat to force dry your tumblers while using CrystaLac. I know whenever I would try to make my tumblers cure faster, I would turn up the heat in my house, or I would turn up my space heaters to make that tumbler cure a lot quicker than if I didn't have the heat. But with CrystaLac, heat actually destroys the CrystaLac. It does not help. So whenever you want to even out your designs using epoxy, a lot of times you grab your heat gun, you apply the heat, and it works well. Anytime you apply paints to your epoxy, you usually grab the heat gun. With CrystaLac, you do not need any heat. This is a self-level product as it dries. So throw out the heat gun if you decide to make the switch to CrystaLac. And lastly, Grand Finale will harden up over a period of 5 to 30 days, and you can gently use after 5 to 7 days. That is very similar to epoxy. I will go over their curing and dry times once we review their label. Both CrystaLac products and epoxy products are hand wash only. And before we go to epoxy, I want to go over the left side of this bottle. This just explains that CrystaLac and all of their products are non-toxic, non-hazardous, non-yellowing, and completely safe to use indoors. This is very important. This is one of the main reasons why I decided to switch to CrystaLac. This is FDA compliant. You are supposed to use a mask while you're standing or spraying, and this product does bond to not only metal, glass, plastic, ceramic, fabric, but more. I don't know what more is, but I've only used this on tumblers, and so far it's worked great. Now let's read the label of the epoxy bottles. This is Flint Sister Supply Shop Epoxy. This is an amazing brand of epoxy. If you are interested in trying epoxy, I will link her product in the description below. I highly recommend using this epoxy if you are able to use epoxy. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a part 2 epoxy. So you have to mix an equal part of part A and part B. And thankfully with this brand, she really does give you a step-by-step tutorial on her label. So it makes it truly very easy. You will have some mess ups in the beginning, probably like everybody else and like everything else. But once you get the hang of mixing epoxy, it is actually very easy. This specific epoxy is her premium epoxy resin brand. This is her Artist Cure. This does cure like a gloss finish, just like the CrystaLac Grand Finale, and this does have a 4-hour drying time. So unlike the CrystaLac Grand Finale was a 2-hour drying time. This is a 4-hour drying time, but Flint Sister Supply Shop also has their fast dry epoxy. I just don't have any of it available, but I will have that linked in my description. Her fast dry epoxy is about a 2-hour drying time, and then there's always UV epoxy or UV resin. That is a much faster drying and curing time, and you use a UV lamp to cure your epoxy with the UV resin. And it's very similar to curing your nail gel polish underneath lamps, but it's just epoxy for your tumblers. Like I mentioned previously, this does have a higher room temperature, product or usage. It goes up to 85 degrees. Remember when I said I used to use my space heaters to help cure my tumblers faster? I probably had it between 90 and 95 degrees during some Christmas seasons, and it didn't affect the drying process at all. So the CrystaLac, you do, and it is recommended to use a cooler space, and the epoxy is recommended to use a warmer space. And just like your CrystaLac, make sure you are sanding and prepping your surfaces and tumblers before you are applying your epoxy to your surface. And the last product is reading the labels of Alumilite's Amazing Clear Cast Epoxy. Again, this is a part A and part B epoxy, but the reason why I wanted to go over this specific brand is specifically because of their labels. I screenshot the photo on the screen, and if you can, go ahead and zoom in and really try to read what these labels are stating on them. Let me just read the label to y'all just in case you can't see it. On the part B side, it says danger, harmful if swallowed, harmful by skin, absorption, and corrosive. And then it says read cautions on back panel. And the part A bottle says eye and skin irritation, read cautions on back panel. And then it goes over the instructions, which are very similar to the Flint Sisters instructions. Let's go ahead and turn these bottles around and let me read just part of the caution area on the part A bottle. It says eye and skin irritation, do not swallow, do not get in eyes, do not get on skin or clothing, keep out of reach of children, wear safety glasses and chemical resistant gloves. And then it tells you everything that it contains. If swallowed, call a poison control center or doctor immediately. Do not induce vomiting. If in eyes, rinse with water for 15 minutes. If on skin, rinse well with water. If breathed in, move person into fresh air. So I know that was a lot, but that's not even the most concerning thing in my personal opinion that's on these warning labels. There's an even more specific warning label underneath that one, and let me show y'all and let me read it to you. This warning says this product can expose you to chemicals including a long E word, which is known to the state of California to cause cancer and or reproductive harm. What? Like, listen, I understand there's a lot of cancers and unknown products going into our bodies using multiple different things, exposing us to things. But like this warning label is very scary to me, especially somebody who has been using products like this for about 8 years before switching over to non-toxic epoxy. As y'all clearly see, the two separate epoxies, just comparing Flint Sisters and the Alumilite epoxy, Although they both have warning labels, Illumilite has a much scarier warning label, and I personally believe that's because this company is a larger corporation company, and this company has probably been sued in the past, or maybe is prepping for a civil lawsuit, and they have an entire legal team who told them to put the dangers of using epoxy. Whereas Flint's Sister Supply Shop, she's been around for probably 5 years or just under 5 years, and maybe she hasn't run into much legal issues when it comes to the effects of using her epoxy. Nowhere on their labels or bottle does it state that these epoxy products are a non-toxic or a non-hazardous product, and that's the main difference when what I see when I compared the CrystaLac and the epoxy products. While we're on the safety topic, let's move on to PPE. So for epoxy users, and if you were to use epoxy, it is recommended that you use PPE, personal protective equipment. The PPE that I used to use is this full face mask, respirator mask. This covers my entire face because a lot of people, they do have a reaction to their skin and eyes whenever they use epoxy. So I made sure to cover my entire face whenever I used epoxy. Also, you are recommended to use gloves. Never handle epoxy barehanded. I see so many crafters, they epoxy their tumblers using bare hands even whenever they are mixing their epoxy, and it freaks me out, but to each their own. And then I always wore an apron to cover up my clothes just in case the epoxy did get on my clothes, because as you can see, that apron, it's pretty crusty at the bottom because that's where I would wipe the excess epoxy off, and I wouldn't care if the apron got crusty. I just wanted to protect my clothes. I will have this mask linked in my description below, and I want to point out that if you are buying and using your mask, make sure you are buying extra filters and you are changing your filters as instructed, because if you have a very old filter that's no longer working, then you might as well not even wear the mask altogether and just breathe in those fumes and odors of your epoxy. As far as using your CrystaLac and what PPE you need, well, as you can see, you really don't need any. I'm applying my CrystaLac bare-handed. I typically use gloves because I don't like messing up my fingernails, but for the purpose of this video, I wanted to apply my CrystaLac using my bare hands, and when I'm finished with this, I just go and wash my hands with warm water and some soap, and it comes right off. If you do get CrystaLac on your clothing or on your workspace and it does happen to cure, just go ahead and soak it in some warm water and your CrystaLac will easily remove. Again, this is a non-toxic, non-hazardous product, and it's very easy to use, and it does save a lot of money if you decide to go this route and not buy as much gloves as you would if you were working with epoxy. Now let's talk about something that I absolutely love about CrystaLac is that it is only one part. So epoxy has two parts, and the epoxies that I have ever used has always been two parts. Part A and Part B, you have to carefully mix those equal parts together. You have to mix slowly, and you have to make sure there are no air bubbles in the epoxy, because if there's air bubbles in the epoxy, then the odds of air bubbles transferring to the tumbler is very high. So a lot of times this is very difficult for new tumbler creators and epoxy users, but for me, thankfully, I picked this up in about a month and I really didn't have too much issues. The key is to really stir slowly and make sure you are not over stirring and stirring quickly. Thankfully, they do have an automatic stirrer from, I believe, Let's Resin, and I used to use that last year, and I just placed two equal parts inside of a silicone cup, and I turned that thing on, and it was basically like a mini mixer, and it just mixed my epoxy for like 60 seconds or so, and it took all of the mixing out on me, and it never left any bubbles behind. So I will find that product and I'll post that in my description below, because that is a lifesaver for all of my epoxy users. And like I say, CrystaLac is a one-part product. So like you see on the screen, this is all you use. You just simply open this, place it on your tumbler, and you get to epoxying or placing your non-toxic epoxy over your tumbler. It really is a time saver. Now let's talk consistency. I'm first going to talk about epoxy. This is going to tie into how many coats of epoxy or CrystaLac you might need on your tumblers. As you see in this video, I'm applying my first coat of epoxy to a glittered tumbler. Epoxy's consistency is a lot thicker than the CrystaLac's consistency. Once you mix both of those parts of epoxy, you can see how thick that coat is being placed on that surface. So since epoxy is so thick, you don't need as many coats as you would if you were working with CrystaLac. For an example, this tumbler is a glitter tumbler. I would put a total of 4 to 5 coats of epoxy on this tumbler. So I would apply 2 coats over my glitter, and then I would place my decal, and I would apply anywhere between 2 to 3 coats over my decal. Not all thick coats, some of them would be thin, but that's just the average coats that I would apply per tumbler if it is glittered. So about 4 to 5 coats, whereas CrystaLac, I am working on a glitter tumbler now, and I am on coat 17. I've applied about 10 coats before I place my decal, and I am on coat number 7 after I place my decal. Again, CrystaLac is a lot thinner than epoxy, and the glitter really does absorb that CrystaLac because it is so thin. Another thing I would like to compare with epoxy and CrystaLac is the alcohol inks. So if you were to do a wood grain tumbler like you see here, you can apply CrystaLac or epoxy over it. It's not going to make a difference. But what you can't do is you cannot use alcohol inks with CrystaLac. They are alcohol based. CrystaLac is a water-based product, so you cannot do any alcohol swirls using the typical Tim Holtz, and all those popular brands that are alcohol based. So that's one downside that a lot of epoxy users don't like. They have all of these alcohol inks that they've had and they spend lots of money on, so they don't want to make the switch because the alcohol inks does pair well with the epoxy. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, this is basically a simple alcohol ink swirl design. You just place the inks onto the wet epoxy, and alcohol inks works so great with epoxy. But the great news about CrystaLac is that they actually have their own alcohol inks, but they are water-based. So they are, I guess, water inks. They are alcohol free, and they do work well with their CrystaLac water-based products. So I actually do have like 10 to 15 colors on hand, but I haven't had the chance to play around with them, and I'm really excited to use them because if you have followed me over the years, you guys know that I have used a lot of these alcohol inks, and one of the most watched videos that I have is my blue alcohol ink swirl tumbler. So I really enjoy making alcohol ink tumblers because it's very nostalgic for me, and they always come out so beautifully. I imagine in probably a week or so, I'm going to break out these non-toxic, non-alcohol inks that CrystaLac has sent me, and I do want to test them, and I want to make a tutorial using them because I am so happy that we finally have some water-based inks that we can use with Grand Finale and still make that beautiful ink swirl cup. Now let's compare the difference between the epoxy and the CrystaLac's odor and smells. Whenever brands claim they have no smell to them, I always find that kind of strange because in my personal opinion, everything that I have ever touched or smelled, it has a smell. But the one thing that epoxy does have is an odor. Now there are some epoxy brands that have stronger odors than others, but and what my experience has been is that they all have a very strong odor, which is why it is recommended to work with epoxy in a well ventilated area. Make sure you are using those exhaust fans and make sure you are off gassing your epoxy space after you finish applying your epoxy to your tumblers and your products. And as far as CrystaLac goes, yes, it has a smell because everything has a smell, but it does not have an odor. The smell isn't aggravating in my opinion. If it was, I probably wouldn't continue to use it because I have a very sensitive sense of smell, and I do have my animals in here while I am crafting, so I don't want to aggravate them or aggravate my sense of smell. And I also don't have to open my windows when I'm using this, so there's no off gassing to this. There's no airing out my space after I use my CrystaLac. I have been crystallacking tumblers between this video, and I have 4 to 5 tumblers on the turner with CrystaLac on them now. I have my pets here, I have my window closed, and it is not aggravating my senses at all. So this topic is going to be my last comparison, and that is the stubbornness of epoxy versus the non-stubbornness of Grand Finale. So what you see here is me sealing the decals onto my epoxy tumbler before I apply my final coats of epoxy. The reason why I have to seal the decals is if you don't seal the decals to your tumbler, when you apply your epoxy, your decals have the tendency to lift up over your epoxy, and then you're stuck with sanding your little hands off and then trying to apply extra coats to have a nice smooth finished tumbler. Thankfully, I found a trick, and a lot of crafters have found a trick and a way to seal those decals down so your epoxy doesn't allow the decals to lift. But before we found this hack or trick, it was just chaos trying to keep your decals from lifting and having a smooth tumbler. I don't know if it was chaotic for everybody else, but it was definitely for me, and that was my biggest issue when I started using epoxy and epoxying tumblers. So that just shows that epoxy is very sensitive. And another thing that happened to me about 6 or 7 years ago is when I first started doing tumblers, I wanted to cut some costs, so I bought some rags from my neighbor who was having a yard sale, and I would use these rags to wipe my tumblers down with my 91% alcohol during my prepping process. I would wipe down 12 to 15 tumblers at a time while I'm prepping because I would prep all of my tumblers at one time. I went to epoxy and designed all of those tumblers, and all of my epoxy tumblers started to repel. If you don't know what repelling is, it's whenever your epoxy separates in some areas and it just does not stick to the surface. I remember having a full meltdown because I just ruined like 10 to 12 tumblers at a time. And when I was doing tumblers back then, I was making money off of custom orders. So those tumblers mattered. I wasn't just making tumblers for videos. Like, that was money and time that I was wasting. And I could not figure out why all of my tumblers were repelling. Thankfully, the rags that I purchased was from my neighbor. So I went to my neighbor's house and I asked them what those rags were used for in the past. And they said they were all the rags that they used to wash and wax their cars. If you don't know, car wax has a lot of oils and a lot of chemicals that I probably don't even know about, but although those rags were washed, they still had all of those products and chemicals on those rags, and that's what was causing my tumblers to repel. I didn't change epoxy, I didn't do anything. All I did was replace the rags. Since I bought those and threw away those rags, I never use rags to wipe down my epoxy tumblers. I am a firm believer of using brand new paper towels, although you do use a lot of waste. But I'm telling you, the brand new paper towels, you can never go wrong because they are always clean. They have no oils. They have no lotions on them. There's no what if somebody used X, Y, and Z on them. And I always cut them into thirds or fourths. So I try to use less products than using an entire paper towel sheet. You just really have to be careful with what you are using with your epoxy, like your lotioned hands. A lot of people, they don't realize it, but they touch tumblers that are in the process of being designed and epoxied, and then they won't wipe down their tumbler, and then they will go to epoxy their tumbler and they realize, or they don't realize, that, oh, it's repelling because I had lotions on my hands and I didn't wipe down my tumbler before I placed my coat of epoxy on it. So there's little tricks about epoxy and little things that I've discovered over the last 8 years or so while using epoxy, and I've learned that it is so stinking stubborn. But once you have it down and once you know its little irks and ticks that makes it angry, it really is easy to work with. Since working with CrystaLac the last 3 or so months, I haven't noticed any of its quirkinesses or stubbornness that epoxy has shown me over the years. I don't know, maybe because me and CrystaLac were in a new relationship and it's hiding its crazy until it wants to come out and surprise me. But on a serious note, I have heard that CrystaLac does have bubbles while you're applying it to your tumbler, but I have not experienced that. If anything, epoxy has shown way more bubbles than CrystaLac, but I have used epoxy for 8 years or so, so I am very delicate and I know the kind of stubbornness of epoxy, so I have used that same delicacy with CrystaLac and I haven't noticed any of those bubbles. I also apply very thin coats, and I have learned that the thinner the coats, the less stubbornness that this product or CrystaLac is, and it is very easy to work with. And those are all the comparisons that I personally experience when switching from epoxy to CrystaLac. All of the videos that you see in this video will be linked in my description below. So all of the tumblers that you see, all of those tutorials will be in my description below. If you are interested in any of those tutorials, just know that most of those tutorials are epoxy based. I am working on my CrystaLac videos as we speak. It just does take time since you do have to add a lot more layers of CrystaLac to tumblers than you would if working with epoxy. I hope y'all enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more tumbler and craft videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.